The dawn air at Naval Station Mayport carried the bite of salt and diesel, a familiar sting that clung to the skin. At Pier 12, the USS Vanguard, a reactivated Arleigh Burke-class destroyer turned training platform, loomed against the gray horizon, its hull a patchwork of weathered steel and fresh paint. Sailors and cadets moved with purpose up the boarding ramp, their boots clanging against metal, while a lone figure stood at the base, unnoticed. James Carver, 64, his weathered face half hidden under a faded Navy cap, watched the ship with eyes that saw more than steel and rivets. His hands, scarred and calloused, clutched a crumpled piece of paper, a dock pass he'd secured through an old contact. "Sir, this isn't a museum tour," a young lieutenant barked, his name tag reading Elliot. His tone was sharp, dismissive, as he waved Carver back. The other sailors didn't even glance his way, their focus on the day's training schedule. Carver stepped back, his gaze never leaving the Vanguard. He saw the subtle lean of the port side railing, the faint hum of an auxiliary generator struggling under load, flaws invisible to the untrained eye. He slipped the pass into his jacket and turned away, his steps heavy on the pier's weathered planks. They had no idea they'd just turned away the one man who could save their ship. James Carver lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Jacksonville, Florida, where the hum of a faulty radiator greeted him each morning. Before his alarm could sound, he was up, his body still wired to the Navy's rhythm after decades at sea. In the dim kitchen, a battered coffee maker gurgled, filling a chipped mug emblazoned with the USS Vanguard's crest, his only mug since leaving the service. At 64, his life was a quiet one. Old shipmates sent texts on holidays, but his days revolved around routine: coffee, odd jobs fixing yacht engines, and evenings spent with nautical manuals yellowed by time. On his living room shelf, 3 items stood sentinel: a scale model of the Vanguard, its radar mast slightly bent, a faded photo of him with his crew on the ship's deck, all grins and sunburns, and a tarnished brass plaque inscribed USS Vanguard, the Unyielding. He polished it weakly, as if the ship still breathed. The Vanguard had been decommissioned years ago, but a recent Navy initiative had brought it back as a floating classroom for tactical drills. Carver learned of it from a crumpled flyer at the marina, authorized personnel only, USS Vanguard, Pier 12. That morning he'd taken a bus across town, then walked the final mile to the pier. The sea wind cut through his worn jacket, carrying memories of salt and steel. When he saw the Vanguard, its gray silhouette framed against the dawn, his chest tightened. The ship's lines were unchanged, bow sharp, command tower proud, the name Vanguard etched in faded white. He stood still, the crash of waves and the creak of mooring lines wrapping him in nostalgia. As he approached the ramp, Lieutenant Elliot was herding a group of Naval Academy midshipmen and technical staff. Carver stepped forward, pass in hand, but Elliot's voice cut him off. "Sir, this ship doesn't take tourists." The words stung, but Carver stayed silent, his eyes scanning the hull. He saw the strain in the mooring cables, the faint flicker of a deck light signaling an electrical fault. He turned away, the pass crumpling in his pocket. Just another day, but one they'd soon regret. 2 days later, Carver returned, keeping his distance. The Vanguard sat heavy in the water, its deck alive with activity as a tactical exercise loomed. Midshipmen darted between stations, instructors barked orders, and technicians wrestled with equipment. Carver spotted Elliot, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to the chaos. Then something caught his eye: a civilian contractor in a gray suit, gesturing at a control panel near the ship's auxiliary power system. 2 technicians nodded uncertainly, their hands hovering over a tangle of wires. Carver edged closer, his boots soft on the pier. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That's the secondary cooling bypass. If you're running it direct, you're risking a surge in the propulsion relays." The group turned, startled. The younger technician, barely 25, squinted at him. "You with the crew, sir?" "No," Carver replied, "but I can show you how to stabilize it." The older technician crossed his arms. "We've got engineers on this. No offense, but we don't need outside help." Before Carver could respond, Elliot's voice sliced through. "Problem here?" The lieutenant strode over, his eyes narrowing at Carver. "You again. I told you, sir, this is a restricted area. Civilians don't get to play engineer." The younger technician smirked, turning back to the panel. Carver held Elliot's gaze. "You're still using the original cooling system, aren't you? If it's not rerouted, you'll burn out the relays in open water." Elliot's jaw tightened. "That's classified. You need to leave, now." Carver nodded, his face unreadable. "My mistake." He turned, his steps slow, the weight of dismissal settling into his bones. Behind him, Elliot muttered into his radio. "Control. Civilian attempting unauthorized access. He's leaving. Log it." As Carver walked away, his hand brushed the pier's railing, the cold steel grounding him. He heard the Vanguard's hum, the groan of its systems under strain. He'd spent years aboard her, coaxing her through storms and system failures, saving lives with a wrench and a prayer. But here, his knowledge was just noise to be ignored. The next morning, chaos erupted aboard the USS Vanguard. At 0600, during a pre-exercise systems check, the auxiliary power panel sparked and died, sending a cascade of errors across the ship's diagnostics. Alarms blared, red lights flashing in the control room as technicians scrambled to isolate the fault. The propulsion relays, just as Carver had warned, were overloaded, their sensors fried by an unchecked surge. The training exercise was halted, cadets sent to the mess hall, and a tense call went out to Naval Station Mayport's command. Rear Admiral Clara Weston, overseeing the Vanguard's reactivation, stood in the briefing room, her eyes scanning the damage report. "How did this happen?" she demanded, her voice sharp as the crack of a whip. The lead engineer, a wiry man named Torres, shifted uncomfortably. "The bypass system wasn't calibrated for the new load, ma'am. We followed the manual, but it's an old ship. The original specs weren't fully updated." Weston's gaze hardened. "Who designed those systems?" Torres hesitated, pulling up a digital archive on his tablet. At the bottom of the schematics, one name stood out. James Carver, Chief Maintenance Supervisor, USS Vanguard, 1985 to 2005. Weston's brow furrowed. "Carver? Why do I know that name?" She opened his service record. 22 years, active duty. Lead technician on the Vanguard's original systems. Commendations for averting a catastrophic engine failure during a typhoon in the Pacific. Noted for exceptional technical acumen and calm under pressure. His final Navy evaluation read, "Trusted to keep the ship alive in conditions that break lesser men." Weston stood, her decision made. "Find him. Now." Lieutenant Elliot, summoned to the Admiral's office, felt the weight of her stare. "You were at the pier yesterday," she said. "A civilian tried to warn you about the bypass system. You dismissed him." Elliot's stomach dropped. "Ma'am, he wasn't authorized. That man was James Carver," Weston cut in. "He built the systems you just burned out. Get him back here." Elliot's face paled. He'd replayed the encounter in his mind all night. The old man's quiet certainty, the way his eyes had traced the Vanguard's lines like a map he'd drawn himself. The lieutenant nodded, grabbing his cap. "Yes, ma'am." Tracking Carver wasn't easy. His name wasn't in the Navy's current contact database. No phone, no recent address. Elliot's aide scoured local records, finally finding a lead through a marina where Carver repaired boat engines. By noon, Elliot stood outside a weathered apartment complex in Jacksonville, the smell of salt and asphalt heavy in the air. He knocked on Carver's door, his uniform crisp against the peeling paint of the hallway. Carver answered, wiping his hands on a rag, his Navy cap still perched on his head. His eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice was even. "Lieutenant?" "Mr. Carver," Elliot began, his tone stripped of yesterday's edge. "Could we talk? Would you meet me at Pier 12 this afternoon, 1500 hours? Carver studied him, then nodded. "I'll be there." At 1500, Carver walked up the Vanguard's ramp, his steps slow but steady, the pier's creak mingling with the ship's low hum. No one stopped him this time. On deck, Admiral Weston waited with a small team, Elliot, Torres, and another engineer, both looking sheepish. Weston stepped forward, her handshake firm. "Mr. Carver, welcome aboard. I understand you know this ship better than anyone." Carver's eyes flicked to the deck, a flicker of nostalgia softening his weathered face. "Didn't mean to stir trouble, Admiral." "You didn't," Weston said, turning to the team. "Mr. Carver designed the systems we're struggling with. He tried to warn us, and we didn't listen." Elliot stepped forward, his voice low but clear. "Mr. Carver, I misjudged Legendra. I dismissed you without knowing your history. I'm sorry." Carver met his gaze, seeing the sincerity in the younger man's eyes. "You were doing your job, Lieutenant. Protecting the ship." Weston gestured toward the control room. "We'd like your help, Mr. Carver. The auxiliary systems are unstable, and we're out of options. Will you join the team?" Carver glanced around the deck, the Vanguard's familiar lines pulling at him like an old friend. He nodded. "Let's get to it." Inside the control room, the air was thick with the scent of burnt wiring and ozone. New panels had been installed overnight, but the diagnostics still flickered with errors. Carver approached the main console, his hand's SDDIF hand tracing the wiring like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "This is the original thermal bypass," he said, kneeling to inspect the panel's underside. "The insulation's too thin for open water conditions. You'll get corrosion and shorts within days." Torres, the engineer, nodded. His face flushed. "We adapted the original model. It's discontinued, so we improvised." Carver's voice was calm, instructional. "You need to isolate the autothermal control, recalibrate the sensors, and reroute the bypass through the secondary board to prevent surges." He pointed to a cluster of wires, his movements sure, as if the ship were an extension of himself. Weston watched, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. This wasn't just a fix, it was a homecoming. Carver worked with quiet precision, his hands steady despite the years. By dusk, the system was stable, sensors humming at full efficiency, the console's lights steady green. In the briefing room, Weston addressed the team. "You train by manuals. Mr. Carver trained by keeping men alive in storms and combat. His knowledge saved this ship today." The USS Vanguard's engines growled to life a week later, their deep hum vibrating through the steel hull as the ship prepared for its first open-sea validation since reactivation. The training exercise, a simulated emergency response, ran without a hitch. No flickering sensors, no electrical faults, no mechanical hiccups. The crew moved with precision, cadets executing drills with newfound confidence, the ship cutting through the Atlantic's swells like a blade. In the final report, Admiral Clara Weston included a rare personal note: operational success attributed to the expertise of James Carver, whose unparalleled knowledge of the Vanguard systems ensured mission readiness. Carver read the report at his kitchen table, the morning light filtering through a cracked window in his Jacksonville apartment. A young sailor had delivered it by hand, saluting before leaving without a word. Carver traced the words with a calloused finger, then folded the paper and tucked it into a worn metal box, alongside old letters and a faded photo of his crew. He didn't smile, didn't linger. The ship was sailing again. That was enough. The next dawn, as the Vanguard prepared to depart for its official revalidation mission, Carver arrived at Pier 12 before the first light broke. The sky was a deep indigo, streaked with orange at the horizon. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries blending with the creak of mooring lines and the soft clank of deck equipment. He stood alone, his old Navy cap clutched in one hand, his eyes fixed on the Vanguard's silhouette. The ship was alive, its lights winking against the water, its hull gleaming under a fresh coat of paint. Lieutenant Elliot spotted him from the upper deck and descended the ramp, his steps careful, his face softened by respect. "You came to see her off," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Couldn't miss it," Carver replied, his voice steady, his gaze still on the ship. They stood in silence, watching the crew load final supplies, check lines, and run diagnostics. The air thrummed with purpose, the Vanguard waking from its long sleep. Elliot shifted, his hands clasped behind his back. "You could have stayed aboard, Mr. Carver. The team wanted you for the mission." Carver's eyes crinkled, the closest he came to a smile. "I sailed her once, long ago. It's your turn now." Elliot nodded, his voice low. "Thank you for what you did and how you did it. You taught us more than just systems." The engines roared, a deep, resonant pulse that carried across the pier. Mooring lines were cast off, and the Vanguard began to move, gliding smoothly into the channel, its hull catching the first rays of dawn. Carver didn't budge, his eyes tracking every inch of her progress. As the ship passed the pier's end, he raised his cap, pressing it to his chest in a silent salute, his scarred hand steady against the faded fabric. The Vanguard vanished into the blue, its wake rippling against the horizon. Carver took a long breath, the salt air filling his lungs, grounding him. He didn't need to be aboard. A part of him sailed with her, etched in the systems he'd built, the lives he'd saved, the ship he'd brought back to life. Back in his apartment, the brass plaque, USS Vanguard, the Unyielding, gleamed on its shelf, polished to a mirror shine. The scale model destroyer sat beside it, its radar mast still bent, a reminder of storms weathered. The photo of his crew, their faces young and fierce, held pride of place. Carver's routine continued. Coffee in the chipped mug, odd jobs at the marina, evenings with his manuals. But something had shifted. The Vanguard's hum lingered in his bones, a quiet affirmation that his work still mattered. At Naval Station Mayport, the crew spoke of him in hushed tones. "The old guy who fixed the ship," they'd say, passing the story to new midshipmen. Admiral Weston ensured his name was added to the training program's records, a footnote for the next generation. James Carver, the engineer who kept the Vanguard alive. Lieutenant Elliot, now a mentor to younger officers, made it a point to teach them to listen, to look beyond rank or age for expertise. "We almost lost her," he'd say, gesturing to the Vanguard's berth. "One man's knowledge saved us. Don't ever dismiss that." Months later, a small package arrived at Carver's door, no return address. Inside was a challenge coin, its face etched with the Vanguard's crest and a single word, unyielding. Tucked beside it was a note, unsigned, in crisp handwriting, "For those who keep us sailing." Carver turned the coin in his hand, its weight familiar, like the shell casings he'd once carried from a long-ago deployment. He set it beside the plaque, a quiet addition to his shrine. The Vanguard sailed on, its missions a testament to the